I was just talking to another parent, and one of the things they said really struck me and all the way to the heart. It's such a hard thing. They said they were worried that their kid is a narcissist, and I've heard so much recently about narcissism, and it seems that the accepted response to worrying about somebody in your life being a narcissist is to identify the behaviors and then just cut them off completely, because narcissism is toxic and incurable and all these bad things. And when it's your child, that just is so difficult. Nobody wants to cut their children out of their lives, but I think it's possible that some people kind of emotionally wish they could. It's very distressing. And so I have some important thoughts that I want to share that are going to hopefully help everybody look at it a little bit differently and see what it's possible to actually do. Because while sometimes it's true in adults, narcissism is very difficult to intervene and change. That is not the case. So we're going to talk about kids, narcissism. The way that a lot of us talk about narcissism in children is using words like bullying, a bully, which is also often very dismissed. And we're going to talk about the roots of some of these behaviors and what to do about them today. So I'm going to get my stuff together. I definitely want to share some insights that are going to be actually helpful, instead of just saying, toss him out, that's a garbage person. I don't believe in garbage people. So we're going to figure this one out. I'm not saying this is the only answer, but if we understand that one of the answers might be, oh, my child is experiencing shame-based anxiety, then it's really a lot easier to figure out what to do about it, how to help everybody get through it and make everything better, because that's the whole point. One of the things that is really important insight that has been added to this understanding of how to answer this question was recently published by Brene Brown in her new book. And one of the things that she said is narcissism is the manifestation of shame-based fear. And that is a key to understanding what's going on when somebody exhibits these behaviors. Let's take it back and start by talking about anxiety, fear in general, and how it's thought of and different ways of categorizing it. And that'll give us a basic understanding as we move towards shame-based fear. Most of the time when we talk about anxiety, we're talking about something to do with a physical fear, something to do with your body and your mind that you're afraid of. So a lot of the phobias are like this. I'm scared of spiders. I'm scared of snakes. I'm scared of high places. I'm scared of being hurt, basically. And some of the obsessive compulsive disorder manifestations are also in this category. Hand washing and the compulsion to do that has a lot to do with a fear of germs or being sick. A lot of the checking has to do with a physical fear. I'm checking the stove. Is the house going to blow up? Things like that. So a physical body fear is one of the ways that anxiety can manifest. Another way that we think about anxiety is social anxiety. And this, instead of being a physically based fear, is a socially based or embarrassment fear. And so a lot of people with social anxiety will avoid being up in front of people in one way or another. Depending on who you talk to, some agoraphobia can also be involved here. So I'm afraid of being in a place where I can't leave. Some of that's embarrassment. Some of that might be physical. This isn't something that you can make always clear definitions. You can be afraid of a lot of things at the same time. But generally, when psychologists talk about anxiety, they divide it into those two categories. Shame-based fear is a little bit different. Whereas if I have a physical-based fear, I might do things like checking or washing or avoiding something in particular. If I have an emotional or a embarrassment-based fear, then you see a lot of people, they'll get really quiet. They'll close down. They'll run away. Shame-based anxiety can manifest in some of those ways, but it really has its own way of manifesting. Shame is this feeling of worthlessness or brokenness, powerlessness, being unlovable, irredeemable, unfixable, unworthy of love and belonging is how Brene Brown puts it. Now, shame is an emotion, and emotions come in waves. All of our emotions start small, build up, sometimes really fast, and then they crest, and then they go back to normal. Some emotions are really small and create little waves, little ripples in our lives. Some are really big, and they're difficult, and they crash on us. And the only thing that you can really do in those circumstances is have the skill and the strength to ride them out. You want to be able to surf those emotional waves. You can't control it, but you can certainly control yourself and get through it in a way that works for you. And another thing that we can do when our emotions come is get down underneath all those crashing waves. The point of meditation or awareness work is not to turn off or crush your thoughts and feelings. It's really to get a different perspective and go to the sort of quiet center of yourself that can observe what's going on. So we can expect shame to grow and then peak and then lessen just in the same way any other emotion does. But the problem is that when shame acts as a trigger for fear, there's something that keeps it going. So you end up on a circle of shame instead of this wave shape. So you begin to feel shame, but then the shame-based fear kicks in, and that confirms your feeling that the shame that you're feeling, those messages are true. And if those messages are true, then you start to react and respond in ways that reinforce them. And then that fear comes true, right? Then you are separated from other people, or you are treated as if you're a bad person, or you are acting as if you're a bad person. And when those fears are confirmed, then the shame wave begins again, and it grows again, and it crashes over you another time. But then the fear engages it again and keeps it increasing and keeps it working. So you end up on a carousel or in a cycle of shame because the fear or the anxiety about it keeps it going instead of letting it ebb, just like normal feelings usually do. It's just a very different sort of a feeling, and it goes right to the core of who you are. And when we feel I'm broken, I'm bad, I'm worthless, nobody could ever love me, those kinds of thoughts and feelings get really scary because we are social creatures. We, from the very beginning, as an infant, we are built to connect to other people. Shame just dives right at that ability to connect or the feeling of worthiness to connect. And then that isolation, but it's isolation because you're broken or you're bad. That is a really scary thing. And so a lot of people who feel a deep sense of shame will respond in ways that make sense if you really think about it, but on the surface can really push people away, which doesn't make sense. But they're protecting their sense of self. They're protecting their sense of, I am a good person. And so you can see this in a lot of the things that we think of as narcissistic behavior. If somebody is deeply in shame but wants to counteract that in a way that isn't very healthy, you can see people feeling and saying and telling everybody how special they are. We're contradicting that I am broken, I am bad feeling by I am special and worth a whole lot. In fact, a whole lot more than other people. That helps them feel less broken, but it also often invites people to distance themselves, which is really unhelpful. Oftentimes you'll also see people who have a very sensitive shame anxiety be really angry and lash out at people if they feel the least bit judged or found wanting in any way or told that they're not good enough. You've touched a really sore spot, and so there's an angry response saying, no, that can't possibly be true. And so sometimes it's very difficult for someone deep in shame to take accountability for their actions, but even just to hear feedback that we all get when we interact with other people or we go through our lives, and we're just not perfect people. Another thing we often see with people who have shame-based anxiety is a very low tolerance for distress. The higher the level of stress, and even low levels of distress, sometimes they just have a super short fuse and they either break down or blow up without a whole lot of what feels like reason. And again, if any little mistake I make is proof that I'm a bad person or I'm unworthy of love and connection or that I'm broken, then it doesn't take much for me to feel overwhelmed by that. And so even the smallest things or the smallest pressures can sometimes feel like an overwhelming amount of evidence that I am really actually bad, and you have to fight or push back against that or just shut it down so it stops happening. And so you'll get people avoiding stress or responding really negatively to stressful situations. Another thing that happens when you have a deep sense of shame-based anxiety is power problems. So either giving yourself way more power than is appropriate. So you'll hear, I can do whatever I want and not have to worry about the consequences for other people. Or having power over other people in a way that's not appropriate. So manipulating or trying to force people to do things, and basically you have to do what I want. So either way, it can get out of hand and be a really unhealthy way to manage power and relationships and power dynamics in a community. So you can see how any or all of these behaviors fit neatly into the category of bullying. And if you take them to an extreme and have them happen over and over, they tend towards narcissism. Is my child a narcissist? The answer is no, even if they're doing these things. And the reason is that a lot of these behaviors are really normal and natural part of humans growing up. So one example is little children. So if you take a 2 or a 3-year-old, it is actually really normal for them to lash out when they don't get what they want or to insist that they always get what they want. It's really natural and normal for them to literally hit or bite or kick or throw things at the people around them in order to assert some kind of authority. As kids get older and their brains continue to develop, something that happens is that sometimes the emotional part of the brain develops a little faster and gets ahead of the thinking and making good choices and not being impulsive parts of the brain that manage that. So you'll see emotions getting really big again and sometimes feeling more out of control. And that includes shame. So there might be periods of time where it feels like these behaviors are coming back and maybe even getting worse. And it's a matter of time and it's a matter of teaching to intervene and help children manage the shame that they feel. And especially if there's fear tied to that shame, then it just makes everything much harder. But it's still really possible. It's not easy. And this is a really important point. It absolutely feels like you're being bullied by your 2-year-old or your 3-year-old or your 5-year-old or whoever. When these behaviors pop up, even if you understand that they're developmentally appropriate, they're not fun and you feel bullied or even abused. Nobody deserves to be hit. And we understand why they're doing it, but it can still have a really great emotional impact for the person being hit, which is why we respect parents so much. But it's also why it's really important as a parent to get some support and to understand about development so that it's easier to understand what's really going on and not take it as personally, but also there's a place to go and process all of those emotions that come up, because no, you don't deserve to be hit or screamed at or have somebody say, I hate you, or any of those things, no matter how appropriate they are. If it's happening and it's distressing, work it out with a therapist. But no, your child is not a narcissist. There's a whole other side to shame-based anxiety. You want to think of it along a spectrum. Narcissism would be on this end. It's like beyond bullying. On the other end of the spectrum are our doormat friends. And these are people who twist themselves into knots in order to please others. And they're always saying yes. And they're always saying, yes, you're so right. And a lot of that kind of behavior comes from a feeling of, I'm not worthy enough on my own. And I don't have the social capital or the internal sense of self to stand up for myself and say, this isn't healthy for me, or I don't want this. Here are my wants and let's talk about it. Instead, they feel like I'm worthless, so I have to say yes. I'm worthless, so I have to go along. Somebody else should lead. Somebody else should tell me what to do. Instead of angry outbursts or insisting that you're always right, you get withdrawal and shutting down and not ever asserting, even if you have needs or even if somebody's hurting you. And so that doormat way of being is sort of the opposite end of what's going on with shame-based anxiety. It can manifest in both ways. When you feel shame-based anxiety, you are not doomed to do these really negative, unhealthy, responsive behaviors. There are healthy things that you can do. First thing to remember is that empathy is the antidote for shame. A lot of times we want to respond, especially if somebody's over here on sort of the bullying end of the spectrum and using power inappropriately or blowing up at things or insisting that they're special. We want to absolutely just smush that and say, no, you can't use this power, and shame on you for being mean, and shame on you for using power inappropriately. You're not that special, and or do punishments to help them not behave that way anymore. And you can see if the basic problem is that I believe I'm broken, unworthy, unlovable, that to be severely punished or to be told you're not that special, or you're a mean, bad person, or you're such a bully, that just reinforces the shame, which is probably going to reinforce the behavior, which is too bad. Let's not do that. So empathy is actually the antidote for shame. Thank you again, Brené Brown. And one of the cool things to remember about that is that if I can show empathy to somebody who is feeling shame, then I'm modeling a behavior that's going to help them figure out how to feel better, because we feel isolated and disconnected and unlovable when we're in shame. And so if somebody can give empathy to other people, then they're going to be more connected to other people. Another thing that I'm doing is directly contradicting the belief that they are unworthy of love, because I'm here right in front of them, loving them, and I'm showing them compassion, and I understand them, and I care about them. And so experience is absolutely the very best teacher possible. The only way really to change our mental filters and models of the way the world works is through direct experience. I can tell them they're lovable a million times. It probably won't sink in. I can teach them. I can give very logical presentations about it. But to actually experience somebody loving them, that's what's going to start to change that internal model. And it directly contradicts the model of I'm broken, I'm bad, I'm worthless, nobody could ever love me. So showing them empathy is a wonderful first step and a powerful thing to do that contradicts the base underlying problem. Another thing that showing empathy does is it directly contradicts the impulse to do a lot of those negative behaviors. Empathy is a social support, and that allows us to process our emotions in much more healthy ways. And so I'm much more likely to choose a healthier way of responding to my emotions, or that feeling of being stressed and overwhelmed and not being able to handle it. Now there's somebody here with me, and maybe I can handle it. And so maybe I can start feeling some of the feelings I feel instead of pushing them away or putting up barriers and boundaries. So if somebody's in front of me showing empathy, I'm much less likely to feel justified in an angry outburst. If somebody's in front of me showing empathy, I can't accuse them of judging me, because they're not. I can probably try and accuse them, and that might happen a few times. So let's be really clear. These things don't change just because you're empathetic one time. It's probably going to take multiple experiences. But showing empathy and really consistently practicing empathy will probably help bring those barriers down and bring us to more healthy ways of dealing with shame. An antidote to shame is naming it and speaking about it as shame. Because not only does that normalize it, everybody feels shame. We don't have to be afraid of it. That sort of addresses the anxiety part of shame-based anxiety. But shame is an emotion. It happens to you, within you, but it comes and it goes like any emotion, and it isn't who you are. This is why we don't say, I am depression. You're not. Your emotions are part of you, but they're not the whole entirety of who you are. And so it's easy to misunderstand with shame, because shame, it feels like I am broken, I am bad, I am worthless. And those kinds of feelings are very self-based, or people think I'm worthless, or people think I'm bad. But when we can actually speak them, we say, I'm feeling shame. It separates you from that I am shame or I am worthless. Like, I'm not worthless, I'm not bad, but I am feeling shame right now. And when we can actually switch over to be using those kinds of words and descriptions of what's going on, that's a very powerful thing. And it also helps us redirect into guilt. Guilt can be a really healthy thing. When I make a mistake, I've made a mistake, I want to acknowledge it and fix it. And everybody has that. Everybody has mistakes. But it doesn't mean that I'm bad. It just means I made a mistake. And so talking about shame as shame and calling it what it is helps us then redirect those ideas and those thoughts around shame towards, okay, so I may not be bad, but I did make a mistake. Now we can fix it. Now we can be accountable and we can make it right. And with kids, that's a really good redirect. But often, if they're deep, deep, deep down into shame, you have to be able to sort of pull them out of that first before. And we don't want to, as parents, what we want to do is we want them to fix it. And so if you don't address the shame first and talk about it, identify it about what's going on, and then move towards, okay, but I made a mistake, then you're not going to be very successful because they're going to pop into some of these behaviors, either shutting down completely and becoming wishy-washy about doing anything, or getting angry and asserting and trying to defend whatever happened. So if you can back off about doing the accountability is a good thing. Just pause it for a second. And making it right is a good thing. Just pause it and move towards, let's identify what the feeling is right now, and we can deal with that feeling. And then it's a lot easier to say, okay, we've acknowledged that, we've talked about it, shown some empathy about it. And now can we move into, are you really a bad person? Does this really mean you're broken? And it doesn't. But do we need to fix it? Yeah. So then, a lot of that tension has gone out of it, and people can move towards making things right, which is super, super, super healthy, as opposed to either end of this shame, anxiety spectrum. Setting clear boundaries. So having people understand what is okay and what is not okay, what is wanted, what is not wanted, really helps, because if any little failure is a trigger for shame, then having wishy-washy boundaries and not being clear sets them up to fail a lot more often. And so if there's something that a child wants to do and they're really not allowed to do it, saying, well, kind of, maybe do it a little bit, maybe sometimes clear boundaries. It needs to be clear for them so that they can succeed and so that they know what the good choices are. And then celebrating those boundaries when they're kept. Those are really important things too. And they might not feel great about the celebration, but you do it anyway. Those little celebrations build up over time, and they send the message, you are in control, you are making great choices, and you can keep these boundaries and be part of this community in a way that's really acceptable and helpful. So send that message as often as you can without being weird about it. Every kid's a little bit different and they're going to respond differently. So celebrate in the way that the child really responds to. Some kids would love a dance party every time, and that would be really over the top for some kids. So just a little quiet, yes, you did it, is just as good, depending on the kid. Okay, so we're expressing empathy and we have clear boundaries that we celebrate in really positive ways when they're kept. And now we're going to talk about teaching empathy. When people are overwhelmed with shame, it is really difficult to see the effects of their behavior on other people. In fact, it tends to turn us inward. That's what pain does. That's what fear does. In a lot of ways, it makes us pay a lot of attention to what's going on inside of us, and we might miss what's going on for other people. And so one of the best things to be able to do is to open up and to connect with another person. And that's a skill that takes time and practice. And I'm going to say it takes time and practice at every stage of development. So you're going to learn how to do it as an infant in a way that's a little bit different than as a toddler. And you're going to be a little bit different when you get into the 6, 7, 8-year-old stage. And then you're going to connect a little bit differently when you get to be an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old. And then that's going to be even different when you're 16 and even when you're 25. And so it's a skill that has to be relearned as it applies in different situations as you grow. And it goes a little bit deeper every time. So it's super fun to watch kids master this skill. One of the things that we can do is break it up into its compound skills. And we're going to get really small and granular here. One of the skills involved in empathy is recognizing emotions. And this is a basic part of your emotional intelligence, but it's not super easy to do. And emotions are going to change as you get older. And so recognizing emotions is another thing that we get to practice differently over time. And you can just do it very basically, not in a situation where there's any shame involved. What are you feeling right now? Can you give me a name? Let's talk about different ways of being angry. Are you peeved? Are you frustrated? Are you really, really enraged? Like, there's lots of different kinds of anger or sadness or joy or peace. There's so many different ways that people can feel their feelings. And it's different for everybody, but it's great to ask what's happening in your body as you're feeling this. What would you call this? What noise would you make? All those are really good questions. Okay, the next bit of empathy is called perspective taking. And we often reduce empathy to this idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Brene Brown points out that that's actually not a good way to think about it, because we tend to do that. We say, well, if I was in your situation, here's how I would feel and how I think you should respond. But that's not really what perspective taking is all about. And that's not really what empathy is about either. It's about seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And that means if you were in your situation, how would you perceive it? How would you feel? How would you react? And this is made very clear when children are little. And this is one of the reasons we do basic things like bend down to their level in order to speak with them eyeball to eyeball. When you take their perspective, it's a lot easier to connect. As kids get older, we may be not as good at recognizing that we need to do perspective taking, but everybody needs the skill of listening and learning from someone to the point where you understand how they see a situation. And then you can understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling, why they're reacting the way that they're reacting. That's called perspective taking, and it's such a good skill, and it also takes a lot of practice. Two of the really important pieces connected to perspective taking successfully are focused attention and the ability to take in information and understand what you're taking in. Bring your attention back and really listen and not get distracted, but stay focused on the person who's speaking and what their behavior's like, what their face is doing, how their body language is working. Humans will take in that kind of information pretty naturally, most of us, but we have to actually focus and put our attention consistently on that person. So at the end of the day, sit down with your child and say, okay, so how did it go? And show attentive listening where you're just focused on them. There's nothing distracting you. And then see if you can get them to do the same thing for you. You can do that in storytelling, in imagination play. There's lots of different opportunities to just practice that focused, non-distracted listening. And then the other piece of it is taking in information. When we listen for information, we're training our brains to not just pay attention and not get distracted, but to pay attention so you can learn something. This is a great skill in school, but it's a good thing to practice specifically with another person telling about themselves or telling about an experience. It's sometimes fun to do this with characters in a book or in TV that you're experiencing together and say, okay, they just told us something about themselves. What was it that they were telling us? Or we just saw them go through this experience. What do you think it was like for them? What was going on for this character as they said this or they did that? The next one is setting judgment aside and being okay with what is. A lot of times that's a very difficult thing to do. because we are judging people. We like to rank things. We like to notice patterns. We like to figure out what's good and what's bad. We like to label things. This is what humans tend to want to do. But to be able to sit, especially with an emotion, and not say this is a good emotion or a bad emotion or a good experience or a bad experience. It just is what it is. And I'm not going to say that it's good or bad. That is a really excellent skill. And it's really important when you're showing empathy to somebody else, because if we jump right into our judgmental ranking, this is good, this is bad, you're stupid, is very short hop from that. And that's what shame is all about. Shame is judging the human behind the action, the human behind the emotion. So if we can stay out of that, it really helps us to practice the rest of empathy, continue perspective taking, continue understanding the emotion that's happening, and then move through the rest. Okay, the next skill involved in empathy, we think that we're done, right? We think that I get you, so that's it. That's what I did empathy. And the truth is, it doesn't work unless you can communicate your understanding to the other person. Empathy is a connection experience. It's not just an intellectual understanding. And so the next step is to gain the skill of being able to communicate that understanding to the other person. And usually that's some kind of reflecting back, something that they've experienced. You don't want to just say back what they said. So it can get tricky, and you want to try it. You want to be able to practice it in lots of different ways in low pressure situations so that you'll be able to have that skill available. Okay, so this step is actually at the very core of why empathy is so powerful, and it's acknowledging a common humanity between you and the other person. And so, for example, they might be going through an experience that is foreign to you, or they might be reacting to an experience that is one that you've dealt with, but reacting in a way that you wouldn't react. And so they're having feelings, they're responding in lots of different ways, and you can understand what's going on for them. But the next step is to find the part inside of you that really gets what they're feeling. So, example, my friend is a wonderful person and her beloved dog died. I've never owned a dog. I'm allergic. So her experience of grieving the loss of her beautiful dog was pretty foreign to me. I wouldn't, if I put myself in her shoes, I probably wouldn't have those same emotions. However, I do know what it's like to lose somebody that you really care deeply about. And I can get in contact with those emotions, and humans tend to feel similar emotions. And so I can find that part of myself that really understands grieving a loss. I can bring that to the conversation without taking over. I'm not going to say, I totally get exactly what you're feeling, and let me tell you why, and now it's all about me. That's not what we're talking about. But if I bring that emotion, if I bring that understanding and that feeling of, I am so sorry, and really bring that common sense of humanity, we understand each other, not because we're the same, but because we're both human. And when we can do that, that really cements the connection part of empathy. So not only do I intellectually get what you're experiencing and why, and not only do I communicate that I get that, but I also can bring that feeling to it, that there's a part of me that really understands how you're feeling. And then this is the last bit. I have compassion. Now, there's lots of ways people define compassion, and we can go into that in a different video. But to me, the basic core of compassion is what you're feeling and what you're experiencing matters. It matters. And I'm going to be very kind about it because it's important. You're important. Your experience is important. And I can respond in a way that is uplifting and kind and encouraging. And that all those responses, those compassionate responses, are based on seeing your experience as super important. And so you can see how, especially compassion, contradicts some of those same sorts of problems that you see either on the doormat side, where somebody says, I'm worthless, I deserve this, I deserve bad things to happen to me, my needs never need to be met. Do you say, I am important. My feelings and needs are important. I can be kind to myself. I can expect that kind of kindness from others in a lot of ways, and that respect that goes along with that. You also see how it's important on the other side that tends towards anger and manipulation and those things that we think of as bullying, that compassion is an antidote to that. The most powerful way to actually teach somebody compassion is to give them compassionate responses in their life. So to keep in your own mind, the mindset, you matter, you're important, your feelings are important, and I'm going to respond to you with kindness. The literature is very clear that being compassionate towards somebody is the most powerful way to teach them compassion. In addition, one of the things we can do is notice when they're being compassionate, even if it's just a little tiny bit, even if you can only sense a smidgen of that feeling towards somebody of wanting to be kind or of knowing that they are important and treating them that way. If you catch your kid doing it and then emphasize that it's important and celebrate it and just highlight it over and over again. Oh, wow, that was a really compassionate response to Bobby. Oh, wow, you really had compassion for that ant on the sidewalk. That if we use the word and help them understand what it means and show them when they're feeling that way and acting in a kind manner because of it, that's going to be very, very powerful in teaching them compassion. Another way to teach it is to talk about it as a family value. This is something we believe in. This is something that we try and do, and it's important to us. Another thing we can do is bring into their lives compassion heroes. And this can backfire if it feels like you're setting a really high expectation that they can never live up to. So one way to tackle that is you don't have to do what they did, but can you feel the way that they felt? Like, I'll never be Mother Teresa, but do I have a feeling towards those people who are suffering, who are sick, or who are poor, or who don't have opportunities? Absolutely. It carries that sense of common humanity, of common feeling that we were talking about earlier, rather than a standard to live up to and judge yourself when you don't meet. And you put all those skills together and then you have empathy. That's what the experience of empathy is. So when we model empathy and also when we teach all of these pieces of empathy and help people bring them together and use them to connect to other people, that directly contradicts the impulse to either make yourself into a doormat or make yourself into a bully. When shame-based anxiety is something that someone is experiencing, finding healthy ways to address it is really super important. And it's just like any other kind of anxiety. When somebody feels a lot of tension because they have fear about their health, they can wash their hands to the point where their hands get completely raw, or they can avoid things like bathrooms to the point where they get urinary tract infections or can't even go to school or things like that. So every kind of anxiety requires that we learn really healthy ways of managing it so that we can respond in a way that will help us to achieve our dreams and goals, to become the person we want to be, live the lives we want to live. Be a little bit more cautious with an adult, because for children, the answer is no, your child is not a narcissist. And for adults, that's not always true. Narcissistic personality disorder is something you should find out about. But just because somebody does some of these behaviors doesn't mean that they're doomed or that they have a diagnosable personality disorder. And it might be a good idea to consider teaching and learning empathy together, along with the boundary setting and along with the speaking shame and all of these skills. They can definitely apply and they certainly can be helpful. But get some extra support. Adults are a little bit different. I hope some of this has been really helpful. I know that it is difficult when something like this, shame-based anxiety, is not in the DSM. It's not something that people are on the lookout for. And the thing that people are on the lookout for is bullying, narcissism. The point is to come away from the extremes and find healthy ways to manage it. So thank you so much for sharing this video with me. If you have other important healthy ways to manage this, or to skills that you can teach children that will help them deal with their shame-based anxiety, Please put them in the comments and maybe we'll do a future video about it. But also, please show this video to your therapist or your teacher, somebody, or your partner, whoever's involved with this child's life, so that you can think for yourselves and try and figure out with the experts in your life how this child is managing their own feelings, their own shame. And if it is shame-based anxiety, we need to start asking questions and we need to start figuring out what can be helpful for them. They're just skills.
That's good.